Good morning. Thank you once again for joining us on this beautiful, beautiful Sunday morning. I guess summer is here. We've had some warm days, but not so warm that it's super uncomfortable. So I hope you're getting out and enjoying that. Today is Communion Sunday, so as Pastor Carl would say, grab your elements and take it with your family. We'll be taking it at church, and we will also be eating a meal afterwards. So we'd love to have you come back and join us at church if you feel comfortable. If not, here we are. And if you've moved out of the area, we understand. We get it. But thank you again for joining us. Our men's group is taking the month of August off, and then they'll start up right after Labor Day with a new study. They're doing a book called The Warrior Within, and it's a 13-week study. We ordered the book, but we haven't gotten it yet, or I'd show it to you. But if you want to be a part of that, let Pastor Carl or Pastor Carlos or CR know, and they can get books ordered, and it's got a workbook with it. I know they'd love to have you be part of that. But like I said, they'll be kicking it off after Labor Day at some point. Our ladies group is still meeting on Thursday nights at 6:30 on Zoom. If you want to be a part of that, Deanna and I would love to have you join us, and of course the rest of the ladies. So let us know and we'll get you hooked up to be a part of that. Today is our regular tithes and offerings, so you know the drill. You can go to thefathershouse.org, click on the giving button, set it up as a one-time gift or a recurring gift. You can give to our missions in Argentina and India that way, or you can give to our stage remodel that we've been talking about in order to raise money for good quality cameras to do our live streaming as soon as we get that set up. So anything you can give towards that, we'd really appreciate. You can also mail a check to the Father's House at 133 Bernal Road, San Jose, California, 95119. Or if you live in the local area and are not comfortable coming back to church and you want Pastor Carl or I to come by and pick it up, we'd love to see your smiling face and pick up your tithe. That's really all I have to cover today, so we'll turn the time over to Pastor Carl now to talk about some extraordinary spirits.
Hey, there you guys are. Glad to have you join us again today. Are you having a good day today? I bet you are. Welcome to the Father's House. Welcome to this time of thinking together. As we've been talking about this notion of an extraordinary spirit. But I just want to find out how you're doing today. Hopefully everything is going well. I know it is in Penny's in our lives. Everything seems to be wonderful. And what can I say? Life is good all the time. The same way that God is good all the time, the life he's given us is the same likewise. So I hope everything's going well. Hope you're enjoying your Sunday morning. And then after this, you'll find something fun to do for the rest of the day. And I'm sure that you will. We're now into the dog days of August. So we've got probably the next 3, 4, maybe 5 weeks, maybe 6, some hot or hotter weather. But here in San Jose, in this area, it's actually been quite cool. It's been kind of an odd summer, but it was an odd winter. And I tell you, rather than having 100-degree weather, having it in the mid 80s to low 90s is quite a relief. And hopefully it'll help with our fire issues that we get here in Northern California. I guess in Southern California as well. So anyway, with that being said, we went to the beach the other day, 2 days ago. Had a great time over at Santa Cruz, La Selva Beach. We walked the beach and hung out and ate lunch there. We had a great time. So if you're here and you get too hot in the Bay Area, you can always take a trip over the mountain and take a nice, cool walk on the beach. I think it was like 70, 74 degrees when we were there, so it was really nice. Anyway, again, thanks for coming, and I guess we should probably get into the topic that we've been talking about. We've been talking about the idea of people, or the concept, people who possess an extraordinary spirit. We're going to talk a little bit more. We talked last week about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and if you didn't get a chance to watch that, you can go back onto the Father's House website, fathershouse.org, and under sermons you can find that, where I talked a little bit about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And I did the same thing on Sunday morning, but Sunday morning I get into a little bit more detail because I have a little bit more time. But that being said, I think you get the gist of it here and what we're talking about. So we're going to leave Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego because that's really kind of last week. They're dealing with Nebuchadnezzar was really the last that they're really spoken of, primarily in the book of Daniel. And so we're going to pick up Daniel now, as Daniel is now going to be in his second king. And Daniel's reign in Babylon, it lasted through 4 kings, so it was a long reign. Started with Nebuchadnezzar, and we're not going to talk necessarily about Nebuchadnezzar, because when we pick up Daniel now, Nebuchadnezzar had died. But remember that Daniel had been promoted by King Nebuchadnezzar, because Daniel had an extraordinary spirit, and he had wisdom above and beyond the rest, and had the ability to interpret and dreams and visions and such. And so he was highly elevated in Nebuchadnezzar's courts. So, but Nebuchadnezzar's either son, we're not really sure what it is, or grandson, ultimately after Nebuchadnezzar died, took over the throne. And so Belshazzar was his name. And so Belshazzar then takes the throne, and we're going to pick up the narrative now with Daniel being older. He's lived through King Nebuchadnezzar, and he would be past 60, maybe even approaching 70, somewhere in there, 68, maybe, I don't know, somewhere in there. Maybe some people would even say older, but let's just say that he's older now, so he's had the chance not just to have the wisdom that he had as a young man, but he's now acquired from his journey in life. He's acquired this, what would you call it, this senior wisdom, or mature wisdom, or seasoned wisdom that's a little bit deeper, a little bit calmer, but in some cases much clearer and more direct in his approach in dealing with Belshazzar, as we're going to see. So we've got to pick up the story, and here's what happened. So Belshazzar gets the throne, succeeding from his father, grandfather, whatever. And so he decides, he's got his wise men and his people that kind of hang out with him, and he decides he's going to have a great big feast. Now, it looks like Daniel at this time had been demoted or hadn't been recognized, because he wasn't at this feast of 1,000 wise men, counselors, and nobles that were here feasting with the king. So the king decides, in the midst of partying, maybe drinking a little bit too much and having a good time, that he was going to go and take the vessels from the vessels that were taken from the house of God in Judah when Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to Jerusalem and took the inhabitants of Jerusalem captive. And he also took some of the worship elements out of the temple, and he put them into their storehouse. Well, so what happened is they're sitting there, and Belshazzar at this time, what he decides to do, is it Belshazzar? I won't look and see. What he decides to do is he's going to take these vessels, the things that they ate out of and the things that the priests drank out of, and he's going to basically defile them. Him, his servants, his wives, and his concubines, and his religious, I guess you could say religious and also political counselors. We're going to have this party, and we're going to drink out of the vessels that had been sanctified by God for use specifically in the temple. Now, it appears that Nebuchadnezzar never did that, the father, and yet here his son, we find him doing this. So in the midst of this, he's partying with his friends, and all of a sudden, he sees by this lampstand, he sees this hand come out of the wall, and it writes an inscription on the wall in front of him. Well, here he is in this drunken stupor with all these people, and he's shocked. And he stops for a minute, stops the party, and when he looks at this, it says that his knees began to, his hips began to get loose, and his knees began to shake, and he almost fell over from trembling. So he sat down and he asked the wise men what it meant. And the wise men said at that time, they couldn't answer him. They didn't know what it was or what it meant. But he knew that it was there, and that what he had seen was an extraordinary thing. So at this time then, because his wise men couldn't answer and explain what it is that this hand and this writing meant, he even was more afraid, and he got more distraught at what was going on. And his mother, who was the queen at that time, knowing that this had happened and probably being summoned by some of the counterparts that were there with the king, came to her son and said, "Look, I have to tell you something. Yeah, you're right. Your guys, these guys that you're hanging out with, they don't have the ability to really address something like this. He said, but I got to tell you something. There's one man in the kingdom that your father would always go to in a time like this. And I have to tell you something, that he's the greatest of all the wise men. He's older now, but I want to tell you that if anybody can answer it, he can answer it. because he has the spirit of the living gods, is what she said, in him. So we're going to pick up that first part of the story of how it is that the king's mother describes Daniel to the new king so that he feels rest assured that Daniel can make an entrance and ultimately answer what this inscription on the wall was. So we picked up the story again in the book of Daniel and in chapter 5, and this is what the king's mother had to say to her son. I'm sorry, I forgot where I was going to be. That I usually don't do that, Drew, right? Oh, here it is. It's in Daniel chapter 5, verse 10. It says, after all, it says, then the queen entered the banquet hall because of the words of the king and his nobles. The queen spoke and said, O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts alarm you, or your face be pale. And wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. Oh, I'm sorry. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And in the days of your father, illumination, insight, and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, appointed him chief of all musicians, conjurers, and Chaldeans, and diviners. This was because, now get this, an extraordinary spirit, knowledge, and insight, interpretation of dreams, explanation of enigmas or riddles, and solving of difficult problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belshazzar. Let Daniel now be summoned, and he will declare to you the interpretation of the writing. So what you see in this text is you see that the queen understands who Daniel is, and then and in understanding who Daniel is that what she does is she says that, you ought to think about inviting this guy to tell you kind of what it is. So in other words, she had kind of consoled him. But what was the interesting thing about that, in consoling her son, the biggest part of that was the idea that she put a finger on who this Daniel was, that he was a man who had the spirit of the gods, of course, as a Christian, or as a Jew. To him there was only one God, the God that he served, and we'll deal with that next week. But the idea was that in the midst of this, what was going on was there was this man named Daniel that had an extraordinary spirit. And remember also we talked about having this extraordinary spirit that incorporated the idea that he was stately. It also had the idea that he was a wise man. He was full of understanding. He was full of knowledge and of sound advice. He had the ability to answer the riddle and to discern the way through difficult and complex problems. And I want to tell you something right now, that the king, he does have an interesting problem, doesn't he, that he's going to have to deal with. And so ultimately he's going to summon Daniel. Now, like what I said about Daniel before, Daniel in this instance, he was at this point, he was older. And he was much more secure in who he was and how he was going to approach this young king. I have to tell you something. In the end of this story, what happened was the king said, look, if you'll come here, what I'll do is I'll make you third in command of all the nation, of all the nation, of all of this kingdom that I oversee. And Daniel kind of said, that's not necessary, but I'll tell you what it is, and I'll tell you what the interpretation is. So with that then, we pick up this conversation. And this is what we kind of want to key in today, in this conversation between Daniel, an older man that now has an excellent spirit, and ultimately this young king in dealing with the issue that's before him. So he goes on and he says, oh, I'm sorry. Here we go. He said, so in responding to him, he goes through this narrative first about his father and how Daniel had helped him and some different things, how God had intervened in him. And so he comes to this son, and his name is Belshazzar. And what he does is, coming to his son is he says, your father never touched. I mean, he took those implements from the temple, but your father never touched those implements from the temple. And the reason that there's this writing on the wall is because you did, and you failed to respect who they came from, who they belonged to, which meant the living God, and what they were to be used for. And so I want to tell you, in this instance, Daniel's going to be very direct with him. So we pick that up in verse 22, and it says this: Yet you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this, that his father had not drank from these things. But you exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before you. And you and your nobles, your wives and your concubines have been drinking the wine from them, and you have not praised and you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see, hear, or understand. But the God in whose hands are your very breath of life, and your ways you have not glorified. Then the hand of the Lord was sent from him, and the inscription was written out. This is what the inscription was, then what it meant. And what was written out was Min, Tekel, Absarin. This is the interpretation of the message. Mene, or Min, I guess it's Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Tekel, you have been weighed in the scales and found deficient. Peres, your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and the Persians. Then Belshazzar gave orders, and they clothed Daniel and put around him a purple necklace around his neck, and issued the proclamation concerning him that he now has authority over as the third ruler of the kingdom. That same night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain. So Darius the Mede received the kingdom, and he was about 62 years old. Sorry for the rough reading, but I just had a problem reading today for some reason. So I want to talk about this story here for a minute and what it is that it means and what's being said here. So we kind of talked about this younger king knew the things that his father had been through with Daniel to some extent, and also how he had been humbled by God, and that he came to the realization that his kingdom was lower than that of the living God. But his son, now coming in and ascending the throne, decided he was going to be foolish. And so in his foolishness, he thought that he could ignore the living God and get away with it. Yet when he finds that God puts this inscription on the wall, and then when God's going to supersede this young man and going to reprimand him, what happens is that when the young man's startled, and his mother comes in and says, there's a man in the kingdom that will discuss with you the things you need to know concerning the writing. They summon Daniel. So Daniel comes in. And when Daniel comes in, the first thing that you want to notice, or you can notice, is that because he's now a little bit older, there's a little bit more confidence in him. It's not that he's not displaying the virtue of humility, because he is. He knows his rightful place in the kingdom. He knows that if this young king wants to take his life, he can take his life. But in the midst of that, he also knows that it's his duty to tell the king exactly what it is that the living God is wanting to convey. So with that, then, he displays this attitude or virtue of humility. But he also displays this virtue of courage, or the idea of being strong-minded. You see, the idea of the virtue of courage, Christian courage, means that in the face of opposition, when we have uncomfortable things to say to kings and rulers and other people, that we always say it with humility, but we always say it with strength of mind. That no matter what the circumstances that are going on around us, those aren't the things that matter. What do matter, and what does matter, is the thing that God is telling us and what he wants us to explain to them concerning their future and the areas that need cleaning up in their own life and in the life, in this case, of this nation. This young king, though, had gone too far. And in going too far, he had offended the living God. It says that in the midst of this, and offending the living God, that what he had done is, he had, rather than giving acknowledgement to the God who sustained his life and gave him the very throne, that he chose to worship the gods of gold, and silver, and wood, and images that had no life, had no understanding, didn't consciously hear or see, and rather he exchanged that than the notion in giving glory and honor and praise to the living God. In that case, Daniel then is speaking about giving justice to God. What he's saying is, Belshazzar, what you have done is you have done a great injustice towards God. You have not displayed the virtue of religion or giving God his just due. And because of that, what God has done is he's seen you, he's weighed you into balance, and he's found you lacking. Because of that, your kingdom will be divided and given to two other kings. In the midst of that, know this: without much consolation, the end of your days is near. The end of your days is marked. In this instance, we see the contrast between two very different spirits. We see in the young king an attitude, an arrogance that's there and present in him, an idea that he can dismiss the living God and think that it comes with it without impunity, or with impunity, that there won't be a consequence for his action. Sometimes when we rise to the position of power, we become a boss, a manager, or whatever the case might be. We think there and in that place that we have ultimate authority. We become politicians or religious leaders or leaders within our community. We sometimes fail to yield to the living God and understand that he's the sustainer and the giver of life, and that the ultimate kingdom and the ultimate glory always belongs to him. It also speaks to us in many ways. We talk about the idea of being humble before God. Rather than spending ourselves trying to live life on our own in our own ways, it's an important lesson for us to learn, that we're to trust and always look to the living God as the sustainer of all of our lives. This young king wasn't able to see that. And because he wasn't able to see that, he was influenced by the wrong people and the wrong ideas and the wrong counselors. And so in this case, he surrounded himself with the wrong counselors that led him the wrong way. But you have to ask yourself the question, where was Daniel in the midst of this? Daniel was not at the party. He wasn't invited to the party. And had he been to that party, he would have not drank from those vessels or eaten from those plates. Instead, he would have abstained or probably slipped off into the background of the party, because he had a different spirit, and he had a different spirit of counsel and wisdom to give to the king. And when the king stood shaken by his own foolishness and the foolishness of his wise men, and he was confounded and afraid, it was his mother that spoke of Daniel. Daniel, an older man, full of confidence and yet still displaying the virtue of humility, stood before the king and told him the truth. He didn't tell it to him arrogantly. He didn't tell him with a haughty spirit. He simply told him that what he had done was a great offense to God. And in that he said, "You've been weighed into balance, O king, and you've been found wanting. In all that you had, and all that you could have, and all that you could be, you failed to recognize a greater God. And because of that, your life will be stripped from you and be given to others." On that night, the king died. And at that same time, before the king died, Daniel was promoted to the third in all of the land. It would be a short-lived position. But nonetheless, maybe the interesting thing is Daniel has now lived through two kings. In both cases, it was his extraordinary spirit that ultimately was promoted before the king. It was promoted for two reasons. Number one, because he had the character that he had. And number two, because God had a plan, and his plan was to promote Daniel for his ultimate ends. When we're ready, when we're prepared, and when we possess the spirit that we need to, we give God the opportunity to move in our lives. But it takes men and women with an extraordinary spirit. Men and women who know who they are, and know who God is, and know that their life is given solely to God first, and then into the service of others. And when we do that, we find ourselves sometimes being elevated to positions where we can speak with humility, compassion, grace, and mercy, but also with truth. I guess today the question for me, perhaps the question for you, is are we a people that desire to become people with an excellent spirit? Is a Father's house a community where we strive to become them, become our best, to understand what it is to walk in humility, to understand courage, temperance, prudence, faith, hope, and love, and above and beyond the virtue of religion, where we give God his just due, and by doing that, we must, of necessity, give justice to all. You see, that's the thing that makes for us, an extraordinary spirit. It's when we submit to God and say yes to Him, to His plans. I hope today you'll think about saying yes to God. I know I want to. I hope you have a great rest of your day. We'll pick it up again next week. I know this one's a little bit short. Sorry for the rough reading early on, but I hope you get the gist of the message. God bless you and have a